All right, we're looking at Mark chapter 8. Okay. We're going to start with verse 1, and we're going to read about the feeding of the 4,000 now.
Another large crowd.
Another large crowd. Okay.
Oh yeah. Bring out the old sermon.
So so he's in a new region, right? So we'll read it. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, they had nothing to eat. He called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days, and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from very far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? They said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and giving them thanks, he broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd, and they had a few small fish. Having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people who sent them, and he sent them away. And immediately got in the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, as we look at this gospel reading, we have to put it in context for us to fully understand it. Now, if we remember, if we go back, right, we have the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 takes place where? In terms of location. All right, this is only back in chapter 6, so we're just finished this, right?
Galilee.
So it's taking place in a Jewish region. You know, it's the apostles returned. They're somewhere in, and so it's a definitive Jewish crowd. Okay, so we have a Jewish crowd. Jesus feeds the crowd. Jesus walks on water, all right? And then Jesus heals Jewish people, all right, in Gennesaret. He then gets confronted by the Pharisees, right, about an issue of eating. All right. Now, do you see the themes going on here? We have eating, we have healing, we have miracles, and then we have discussion about eating. And of course, in this moment, Jesus is basically teaching something contrary to at least the interpretation of the Jews on eating kosher foods. All right. Which, by the way, God never told the Gentiles they didn't have to. So this is a Jewish issue. All right. Nowhere do we have in the entire scriptures that the Gentiles needed to eat kosher. Because if we remember, what was the purpose of kosher? What's the purpose of circumcision, kosher, and the keeping of the law?
To identify them as a separate sect.
Right. To identify these are the people of God. All right, so that ultimately all of what Jesus does is rooted in Old Testament history. It's rooted in history. It's not made up, poop, out of the air. It's all rooted in what? Thousands of years of history, of actually God working throughout people. Okay. Then, of course, we get what? A shift. So he's just been talking about he fed the 5,000. We're talking about eating. And then what do we get? The Syrophoenician woman, right? The Canaanite woman. Now remember, Mark doesn't point that out as well as Matthew, but she's a Canaanite. Okay. Who were the Canaanites? The people that God threw out of the land because of their sin, all right, was so bad, and which you can read about in Leviticus 18 and 20, but they get thrown out. So that who could be put in? The Israelites, right? Okay. Who did Jesus just feed? The Israelites. Okay. But then we have an eating discussion. What's the eating discussion? What makes you clean and unclean? All right. Okay. Now we get to a Canaanite, an unclean person. And remember, she wants a healing. She wants a miracle. And we get into a discussion about eating. Right? And what was the main point of Jesus' teaching to the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman?
These are the crumbs under the table.
Right. He says, I can't give the bread of the children to the dogs. Okay? And she says what? Even the dogs get the crumbs. All right. So she does a faith statement and he heals her. But what is, if we go back, if we remember, what is Jesus saying? He's basically saying salvation. And the word comes to who first?
The
Jewish people first. So there's the important thing. Why? Because this is what God promised. This is how God is revealing it. It has to go to the Jew first. When we look after from the book of Acts on, who does the Holy Spirit first fall on? The Jews first. The very first church is Jewish for quite a long period of time. And then it goes with Cornelius as the beginning of the kicker. And then it continually goes to more and more Gentile inclusion. The Jew first, then the Gentile. All right? Okay. Paul, in all his missionary journeys, if you read carefully, where does he go first? The synagogue first. First I tried to preach in the synagogue, and then if they reject him, he went to the Gentiles. Okay. So we see, this feeding imagery, and then what do we get? We get the healing of the deaf man. All right, and this is the area of Decapolis. Remember, the cities of Decapolis were populated with people that Rome put in there. What's their purpose? The cities of Decapolis are there that if the Jewish revolt, these people are going to fight the Jews. Well, now you can understand he's in a really dicey region. All right, and yet what does he do? He heals. He had sent, remember, the demoniac man as his first evangelist. He now is getting a huge crowd. All right, this crowd, which will have Jews, but is also going to be full of Gentiles. So do you see how he's doing? Jew first, and now he's doing the same thing for the Gentiles. He's literally walking out what he spoke, right? Okay. So we have a Gentile crowd, and it's a big crowd. The last time the crowd came out to Jesus, what did they tell him in the region of Decapolis? Get out. Get out, you're hurting our pig farms. All right? Now what are they doing? They're listening, right? And what we have is that Jesus says to us, they've been gathered, and Mark really doesn't tell us what's going on. All right? So what's going on? They're gathered, and we now have to make assumptions. Okay? Because how long have they been gathered?
3 days.
This crowd is stuck with them for how long? 3 days. If we look at Matthew, I think chapter 15, we see Jesus is doing healings. Now, I don't know about you, but if he's just doing healings, right? If you got your healing, you might watch for a little longer, and then what are you going to do? Go home.
Yeah, but new people who are coming.
The new people are coming, right?
They've heard the
But you
healing
won't
going
keep
on,
right.
and so
But you don't have a great crowd. The indication is that these guys have stayed for how long? 3 days. So Jesus is probably teaching. So these are Gentiles that are what? They've witnessed the miracle, and they're now teaching it. And they're so dedicated to getting this that they're going hungry. So you see why Jesus recognizes this crowd is different than some of the other crowds. They're not just chasing him for the miracle. They're not even there necessarily for food. They may not even know about the 5,000, right? They're there because what? They are soaking it up. And they actually invest 3 days to listen to him. And you know, back then you would have carried a small amount of food with you, you know, for a journey and all that. They ran out. So now they're fasting. All right. Now we see here Jesus has compassion on the crowd. All right. And then we get the whole story just like we did. We have, in this case, how many loaves? 7. How many fish? 2. So we got 5 and 2. And we go through the same thing. We recapitulate what's going to happen in the Last Supper. Just like we did with the feeding of the 5,000, we're now getting it with the feeding of the 4,000. He took the bread, he gave thanks, he blessed it, broke it, and he gave it. All right? This is all going to be picked up again. So this is tying the feeding of the 5,000, the 4,000 with the Last Supper, which is about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay. So some interesting things, I think, about the numbers. Now we're going to go back into the territory of where this is not, you can't take this as gospel, you have to take this as speculative, okay? But it is sort of interesting because the feeding of the 5,000, how many fish?
12.
5.
5 fish.
5 fish. Right. And how many people? 5,000. And how many leftovers? 12. 12 baskets. How many fish? 2. So if we want to take it, into symbolic look at it, like I said, this is, more for fun. 5. What's the main? Why? But you have to ask God, why this? Especially when you think of the leftovers, because the crowd, you could just say, well, that's just how many people showed up, right? But why are the leftovers so different? It's very interesting. Because who made the food? God. So God controlled the amount of food that was made. And yet he allowed this many leftovers here and this many leftovers over here. The bigger crowd had more leftovers. Okay. So 5 we often refer to, remember, as the Torah or the Pentateuch, the Word of God. All right, feeding of 5,000. And if we think of 5 loaves, we can think of 2 things. 2 things, right? So once again, like Pentateuch. But if we go back, because Jesus brings this up in his criticism just afterwards. Remember when the Pharisees talked to him about eating, and he brings up how, well, don't you remember when David went in and took loaves from the temple of presents, right, when Saul was trying to kill him? How many loaves did David take for himself and his men? 5. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? 5 loaves. So you see, and now of course we have how much left over in the feeding of the 5,000? 12. All right, how many tribes of Israel? 12. All right, how many apostles? 12. All right, so this is all very interesting imagery about feeding. Okay, when we get to the feeding of the 4,000, 4 can mean what? Because now remember, who are we feeding? Gentiles. So some would argue, 4 represents 4 corners of the earth. In other words, it's 5 for the Israelites. Now we're going to what? To the world, right? Okay. How much bread do we have? 7. All right, 2 things we can think about that. And this, once again, these are just fun. 7. How many? So some have argued that 7 can mean, right, every day. 7 is a perfect number, by the way. 7 represents completion. God created the world in 7 days. So the whole world, right, which includes both Jews and Gentiles. All right. How many loaves were in the temple when David went and took 5? How many total there were always 12 loaves put before God, each loaf representing the tribes, right? He took 5 the first time, leaving 7. It's just an interesting little thing. All right. How many nations were cursed by God and driven out of Israel? 7 Canaanite nations. 7, right? So some argue this is God, Jesus. In other words, God cursed the Canaanites and those 7 nations. But the curse is lifted under who? Under Jesus. This is why, you can't do, because if you look at the conquering of Israel, you could say, that looks an awful lot like genocide. But that has been taken out, right? Of course, love your enemies as yourselves. Jesus did it that way also. So we see some really interesting numbers when we're dealing with the feeding of the 5,000. The other interesting thing is, and I don't remember the words off the top of my head, but the word for basket in the feeding of the 5,000 is different. The word there actually has connotations with Israel's history, and then Mark uses a different word for basket for the feeding of the 4,000. So, it's just some interesting little things. Okay. Ultimately, what do we see here, though? What we're seeing is that ultimately, tying it all in, we have, especially when we look at the Eucharistic terms of it, all right, to Israel first, to the Gentiles second, but all the world is going to be brought in, okay? And the other interesting thing, and this is in both readings, what does Jesus do to the what does Jesus have the people do before they eat?
Separate into groups.
Well, they do get into organizational groups, yeah, and then he has them sit. Which is when people are sitting, the imagery there and the message there is rest. When do you get your rest? Sabbath. Who claims to be the Sabbath? Jesus. In other words, what work did the people do to be fed? They do no work. Jesus does all the work in order for them. Yeah. So
this feeding of the 4,000 is really very important because it includes all of us now.
Right. Well, it then, yes, which, it helps the church. Now remember, Jesus is teaching the apostles this because the apostles, they're all Jewish. And remember, they're expecting a Jewish Messiah who's going to do what? Get rid of Rome, put them up back on top, right? That's their expectation. That was one of the majority expectation. There were other expectations for Messiah. That's not the only one. One was he would bring, believe it or not, great amount of prosperity. All right, which is, remember, what is Jesus's temptation? One of them was what? Bread. Right? And what does Jesus say? Men cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus is that word. And then that word does what? Makes bread for the people in the wilderness. All right. So we're going to look. So then there's this really interesting thing from the feeding of the 5,000. And then we end up with the disciples in the boat arguing about bread. All right. And then we get into the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida. So let's go, we're going to look at verses 11 to 13. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply, all right, and in his spirit, and he said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them and got into the boat and went to the other side. I'm going to take it down a little farther. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. And they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread?" Do you understand? But because this is a theme, we need to look at from the feeding of the 5,000 all the way through here. This is all one big landscape. Okay. Then when do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many baskets of broken pieces did you take up? And they said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets of broken pieces did you take up? And he said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home, saying, do not even enter the village. Okay. So we have the feeding of the 4,000, right? Where we're into Decapolis. So he's feeding Gentiles, all right? And he gets accosted then by who? The Pharisees, right? Now, the Pharisees, I want you to think of where the apostles are and the Pharisees, and even the Gentiles, right? Because you have Jesus come in, he is a Jew, and then he's doing all these things for these Gentiles. The Gentiles are like, you got to have the mind. Why me? Why is this happening to us? This is a Jew. Why is he treating it this way, right? And to the point they stick around and they want to learn, There's later on where, I don't remember which gospel, where they praise the God of Israel, right? But from the Jewish perspective, if you're the apostles and the Pharisees and the scribes and the Jews, what are you thinking? There's your Messiah. What's your Messiah supposed to do? You should be driving these people in Decapolis out. So they're like, why are you doing this? The Gentiles are sort of like, why are you doing this for us? And the Jews are like, why are you doing this for them? Very different thing. Of course, they then seek a sign. All right, so what does it mean by a sign? They're probably wanting some type, the connotation there is some sort of I can never say the word, apocalyptic sign. An apocalyptic sign is a sign of judgment. In other words, Jesus, show us you're going to do what to all these Gentiles that you're now feeding, right? Show us a sign, right? Now, Jesus, now I want you to think, we'll just go in a little farther along. We got the apostles in the boat, remember, and they're arguing because what don't they have? Bread. And what's Jesus basically saying? Don't you see the signs? In other words, we're in between two major signs. Not just in terms of the feeding signs, which are messianic signs on top of the healing signs. So signs are being done all over the place. And yet the Pharisees demand what? They want another sign. They want the absolute proof, right? Of course, if God, by the way, then faith goes out the window. We have to be very careful. One of the lessons we have to learn, and we have to learn this from the apostles here, is sometimes we're always looking for the next sign. Oh God, I trust you. Show me again. Oh God, you did all this. I don't know if I believe you that you can do this. We see a person get healed, and then we're like, I don't know if he can do it again.
Yeah.
And what do we want? In other words, we're exhibiting a lack of what? Faith. Okay. So the other interesting thing is, of course, if we look at the other gospel, Jesus does tell them, I will give you a sign. What is the sign he tells in the other gospel? It's the sign of Jonah. That's the promised sign. Okay, so what's the sign of Jonah? What happened to Jonah? He went into Sheol. He died. And from the depths of Sheol, how long was he in the fish? 3 days. And then he was what? Resurrected. All right. If you read it carefully, the indication is that he died. Jonah died because he cries out from Sheol. Sheol is the place of the dead. Okay. So the sign is the resurrection. That's the sign. After the resurrection, what do you end up with? The same problem. You know, some people, we have a large group of Jews. All right, that's it, we're in. The Holy Spirit comes, you even have Pharisees, you have priests and things convert, okay? But then you also have what? Those who absolutely reject. All right, so no sign will work for the Pharisees once they hit a point in their heart. Okay. This is almost like a sandwich. We have feeding bread, and now we get bread again. They're in the boat, and Mark is a little interesting here. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, which means they have what? No bread. In fact, later on, Jesus says, "Why are you discussing that you have no bread?" Only Mark puts in, they had no bread, only one loaf. Who's the one loaf? It's Jesus. He's sideways saying they have no bread, just one loaf. Jesus is teaching them, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Okay, so if we remember, right before the feeding of the 5,000, what happens to the word of God in John the Baptist? Right? It gets, so the Herodians and the Pharisees, it's not, this is the political realm of the world and the religious realm of the world, that which is opposed to Christ, okay? Okay, so not all of them, it's those that are opposed to Christ. And he says, watch out for their leaven. All right, so back then, when he's speaking about leaven, and we'll finish it here, because I'm over time. But, so we think of leaven. What do you think of leaven?
Something that rises.
Something that makes bread rise. The primary leaven that we use is, for bread would be yeast. Okay. We have purified yeast and purified conditions. Back in antiquity, you would have basically like what's it called when
Starter.
Yeah, a starter. So they would keep a starter, and then they would take a little bit of the starter, right, and put it into the new mix and let it rise. It would sometimes, need to probably ferment almost 24 hours, believe it or not. And then you fed the starter, right? They didn't have clean conditions. If in that starter you got a bad type of mold, for example, like a rust, all right, or bacteria, and it's infected it, and you put it into your mix to make bread, the bread, even though you started with a little, the bread now is what? Contaminated throughout. And what's he saying? Beware. What? And what's the problem with the Pharisees and the Herodians? They love the world. They love their power. They love these things. And Jesus is warning, because they're sitting there and then they're arguing about what? Their provision. They're arguing about whether they're going to eat, which is no different than the Pharisees worried about losing influence, or the Herodians losing power, right? Smaller, right? Okay. And what does Jesus, and then Jesus goes after him. And what does he say? You do not yet perceive. You don't see it and understand it. Your hearts are what? Hardened. He's asked them it as a question. You having eyes, do not see. You have ears, but you do not hear. Do you not remember what I just did? We gave you a sign from God. And now they've already done what? Forgotten that sign. All right, we're going to start next week. We'll start at verse 22. Read it over and take it into the context of what Jesus just said to his apostles, right? He's just saying what? You see, but you don't see. You hear, but you don't hear, all right? And the cause is hard heart. Okay, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thank you. Thank you for setting up the tables.
Not a problem.